There are moments in history when silence breaks, not with a whisper, but with an earthquake that reshapes everything we thought we understood. Tonight, we're standing at one of those moments, because Prince Harry, the man who walked away from a throne, who chose love over legacy, who promised the world he'd found his forever, is finally telling a story he swore he'd take to his grave. And what he's revealing isn't just heartbreaking, it's a masterclass in manipulation so profound, so calculated, that even those closest to him didn't see it coming until it was far too late. This isn't about tabloid gossip or palace intrigue. This is about what happens when the person you trust most becomes the architect of your unraveling, when the woman you gave up everything for turns your deepest vulnerabilities into weapons, when love becomes a game of chess, and you realize too late that you've been playing checkers. For years, we watched from the outside. We saw the cracks, the headlines, the carefully worded statements, but we never knew what was really happening behind those Montecito gates. Until now, because according to people who've witnessed Harry's private collapse, he's started speaking. Not loudly, not publicly, but in the devastated tones of someone who's finally understanding the full scope of what was done to him. And what he's describing isn't a marriage that fell apart. It's a marriage that was systematically dismantled by someone who knew exactly what she was doing from the very beginning. What you're about to hear will change everything, not because it's scandalous, but because it's real. The kind of real that makes your stomach turn. The kind of real that makes you wonder how someone could be so methodical, so patient, so utterly ruthless in destroying the man who loved them most. This is the truth Harry carried alone, the truth that nearly broke him, the truth that explains why insiders say this isn't just a divorce, it's a demolition. And once you understand how deep the betrayal runs, you'll see this story for what it really is, a cautionary tale about what happens when you mistake performance for love. Stay with me, because the moment Harry's world cracked open didn't happen in a courtroom or a press conference. It happened in the most humiliating place imaginable, on the internet for the entire world to mock. It began with a headline that should never have existed. Radar Online didn't stumble onto Prince Harry's private medical information by accident. Journalists don't wake up knowing the exact medications sitting in someone's bathroom cabinet, the brand names, the dosages, the potential side effects. That level of detail comes from one place, inside the home, from someone who's watched you swallow those pills every morning, someone who knows your routines better than you know them yourself. And according to sources who've watched this nightmare unfold, that someone was his wife. The medications themselves, finasteride and minoxidil, aren't just treatments for hair loss. They come with a shadow, a list of potential side effects that most men would rather die than have made public. Mood changes, emotional instability, and the one that cuts deepest, the whispered possibility of intimate dysfunction, the kind of thing that strikes at the core of a man's identity, his sense of self, his pride. Harry's private struggle became the world's punchline overnight. And it wasn't presented as a leak, it was wrapped in concern. Friends worried about Harry, sources suggesting he'd changed, that the spark had faded, that something was different now. The language was soft, almost sympathetic, but the message underneath was surgical. It said, "This is why things aren't working, because of him, because he's broken, because he can't be the man he used to be." For Harry, the humiliation was immediate and suffocating. But worse than the embarrassment was the realization slowly dawning on him. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a careless slip to a journalist looking for a story. This was deliberate. Someone had taken his most private insecurity, the thing he confided in the darkness of their bedroom, and turned it into a headline designed to gut him. And the person who did it?
She was still sleeping in the same house, still smiling for the cameras, still playing the role of devoted wife. That's when Harry understood. The war had started long before he even knew he was under attack. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. This wasn't about hair or medication, or even public humiliation. This was about something far more dangerous: control. The kind of control that doesn't announce itself, the kind that operates in whispers, in carefully placed stories, in the slow rewriting of reality until you're not even sure what's true anymore. Look at who we're talking about. This is a woman who spent years in Hollywood, an industry built on image, timing, and the ruthless understanding that perception is reality. Every step of her rise, from actress to duchess, was executed with the precision of someone who understands how narratives are built. She didn't stumble into the spotlight, she choreographed her entrance into it. So when the marriage started fracturing, she didn't lose control, she redirected it. Sources say the groundwork was laid months before Harry even realized something was wrong. There were no big fights, no dramatic confrontations, just subtle suggestions to the right people, quiet comments to confidants that Harry seemed distant, that he wasn't the man she married, that something had changed in him, and it was breaking her heart. Little pieces of a story, fragments that, when assembled by the media, painted a very specific picture. A devoted wife, heartbroken by a husband who was somehow failing her. And the public ate it up. Meghan became the sympathetic figure, poised, calm, suffering in dignified silence. Harry became the troubled one, the weak link, the man crumbling under pressure he couldn't handle.
It didn't matter what the truth was. What mattered was who controlled the story, and she controlled it masterfully. Behind closed doors, Harry wasn't just losing his marriage, he was losing the narrative of his own life. Every private moment, every vulnerability he'd shared, every secret he'd trusted her with was now potential ammunition, and each time another story hit the press, another detail he'd never shared publicly, he felt the walls closing in. Because the woman who'd promised to protect him was now wielding his secrets like knives. Privacy, in her hands, wasn't intimacy, it was leverage, and Harry was just beginning to understand how much leverage she'd accumulated. Long before the headlines screamed betrayal, before the leaks started dripping poison into the press, their home had already gone dark. What the world saw as a fairy tale escape to California, a new chapter of freedom and love, had quietly transformed into something else entirely, something cold. People close to the couple say the shift happened after their second child. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't explosive, it was the kind of slow freeze that settles into a house like winter fog, until one day you wake up and realize you can't remember the last time you felt warmth. The passion that once lit up their public appearances vanished behind closed doors. Date nights became obligations, then memories, then fantasies. The late-night conversations that used to stretch until dawn evaporated into silence. The couple that once seemed magnetically drawn to each other now moved through their mansion like strangers sharing an expensive hotel lobby, connected only by schedules and the children they were raising in the shell of what used to be a marriage. Meghan threw herself into projects, anything that kept her image alive, that kept her in control of how the world saw her. Branding, partnerships, public-facing ventures that required her attention and ambition. Harry tried to hold on. He buried himself in the hope that this was just a phase, that the woman he'd fallen in love with was still in there somewhere, that the warmth would return if he just waited long enough, loved hard enough, sacrificed enough. But it never came back. Insiders say Harry felt the rejection long before any of this became public. He felt it in the way she turned away in bed, in the way conversations died before they began, in the way she looked at him sometimes, not with anger, but with something worse, boredom. The realization that the man who'd given up a kingdom for her was no longer interesting enough to keep her attention. And Meghan? Sources say she'd already moved on emotionally.
The spark that fueled their whirlwind romance had burned out, and instead of trying to reignite it, she began planning, quietly, carefully, the same way she planned everything else in her life, because in her world, she doesn't get left behind, she doesn't get discarded, she leaves, and when she does, she makes sure everyone knows it was her choice. Harry, unaware of the exit strategy being drafted in the background, kept fighting for a marriage that had already flatlined. He just hadn't been told yet. When people look back at this collapse, they'll point to the dramatic moments, the leaks, the allegations, the public humiliation. But the truth is, the fall didn't happen in a single catastrophic event. It happened in stages, methodical, calculated, years in the making. And when you map out those stages, the entire story becomes disturbingly clear.
Stage 1, the wedding. The world held its breath as a prince married a Hollywood actress in a ceremony draped in tradition and rebellion. It was a global spectacle. Hymns and diamonds, tears and hope. The palace watched nervously. The world fell in love. And Meghan stepped into the royal spotlight with the confidence of someone who already knew exactly where the cameras would land. Behind that radiant smile, sources say, she was already thinking ahead. Platforms, partnerships, the long-term brand potential of being a duchess. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a launch. Stage 2, the honeymoon. Quick, glamorous, and underneath it all, already cooling. Friends say Meghan described Harry as clingy, emotionally intense, too attached. He thought he'd finally found someone who saw beyond the title, who loved the man underneath. What he didn't realize was that she saw the title perfectly, and she understood its value better than he ever could. Stage 3, after the children. This is where everything shifted. Once the second baby arrived, the house fell into that uncomfortable silence. Harry tried desperately to hold on, but the warmth wasn't coming back. Meghan focused outward, on curated projects and public perception. Harry felt increasingly sidelined, unsure where he fit into her carefully constructed future. The man who'd left royalty for love was now questioning whether love had ever been the point. Stage 4, the hair saga. This is when the leaks begin. Small at first, then sharper. Private details making their way into tabloids with surgical precision, each one chipping away at Harry's sense of security, his sense of self. For him, it was a violation. For her, sources claim, it was strategy, a way to control the narrative before he even realized there was a narrative to control. Stage 5, the videos. Not divorce papers, not a public announcement, just quiet, calculated pressure. The kind that happens in shadows, the kind that reminds someone exactly how much power you hold over them. And by the time the medication story hit the press, the marriage wasn't beginning to collapse, it was already over. Harry just didn't have the evidence yet. If the medication leak wounded Harry in public, what came next destroyed him in private. This is the part of the story that insiders talk about in hushed tones, because it shifts the entire tone from marital breakdown to something far darker, something that resembles psychological warfare. According to multiple sources close to the situation, Meghan didn't just keep text messages or emails as insurance. She kept footage, video clips recorded during their most private, vulnerable moments. Some of it might seem innocent out of context. Other clips were deeply, profoundly compromising. Harry passed out after nights he'd rather forget. Harry stumbling through parties during moments when the world assumed he was healing and thriving. Harry possibly using substances when he was supposed to be the poster child for mental health recovery. And even more disturbing, intimate videos. The kind that were never meant for anyone's eyes but theirs. The kind that, if released, would obliterate what remained of his public image. And here's the chilling part. She allegedly showed some of these clips to friends, not to ask for help, not to express concern, but to prove a point, to demonstrate control. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't explicit threats, it was a quiet flex, the kind of move that reminds someone exactly how much of their life you hold in your hands. A private library of a prince's worst moments, sitting in the phone of a woman preparing her exit.
For Harry, this wasn't just leverage, it was a ticking bomb. Sources say he began living in constant fear of what might surface next. Every argument carried the weight of potential exposure. Every cold glance in the house came with the knowledge that at any moment, one more clip could hit the internet. And the worst part, he had no idea how many there were, no idea what she'd recorded, no idea when the next detonation would come. It was control in its purest, most suffocating form, and Harry was trapped.
Only after the relationship fractures, after the leaks, after the video vault revelation, after the humiliation, does the most explosive allegation surface. And it doesn't appear at the beginning of the story for a reason. This was a whisper that emerged late in the game, quietly, cautiously, the kind of rumor that insiders treat like a lit match near gasoline. Sources claim that Meghan never carried the children herself, that surrogates were used for both pregnancies. According to one alleged insider, even a medical professional supposedly confirmed this. And while there are no public receipts, no definitive proof presented in this account, the implications alone sent shockwaves through certain circles. Because in Britain, lineage isn't gossip, it's law, it's identity. It's the foundation of 1,000 years of history. If this were true, if it were even whispered as a possibility, it wouldn't just be a personal scandal, it would be a constitutional crisis. Questions the palace spent centuries avoiding, doubts about tradition, legitimacy, and the honesty of a woman who built her entire public persona on values like transparency, healing, and authenticity. For Meghan, it was another narrative she could spin: privacy, health, trauma, protection, a story she could frame on her terms, if it ever came to that. But for Harry, sources say, it left him shaken to his core. A man who vowed to give his children the childhood he lost, now wrestling with the possibility that fundamental parts of his own story had been hidden from him, that the life he thought he was building was constructed on foundations he never examined. It was the final fracture in a long line of betrayals, one that didn't just shake the marriage, it shook Harry's understanding of his own reality. This is where everything comes full circle, because at its core, this was never just the story of a prince betrayed or a duchess escaping. It was the story of two people living two completely different truths, until the distance between those truths became an uncrossable chasm. Imagine Harry now, a man who once walked away from the crown for love, believing he'd finally found freedom, a man who traded castles for California sunshine, centuries of tradition for the promise of peace, royal protocol for raw, honest passion. And yet here he stands, stripped of the very things he thought he was protecting: his privacy violated and sold, his dignity shredded in tabloids, his marriage revealed as a performance, his sense of self dismantled piece by piece. Every secret he shared in trust became a headline. Every moment of vulnerability became a weapon turned against him. Every private confession became a rumor waiting for its moment of release. And on the other side of this wreckage stands Meghan, poised, polished, already moving forward, her leaks carefully planted, her receipts meticulously kept, her reinvention already in progress. Each revelation, each strategically timed story, another piece of evidence that she didn't just leave this marriage, she orchestrated its ending. Because in this version of events, she never fought to stay, she fought to win. And when she said those two words at the altar, sources suggest she wasn't promising forever, she was promising victory. The prince who ran from the throne to build a life worth living watched that life collapse beneath him like sand, and the duchess who once stood beside him, promising partnership and protection, walked away untouched, reputation intact, narrative secure, control never lost. In the end, this wasn't a love story that failed. It was a lesson in power, in control, in the brutal truth that the person who tells the story owns the story. And Harry,
He's learning now what it means to have loved someone who saw him not as a partner, but as a platform, not as a husband, but as a headline, not as a man, but as a means to an end. Even without a crown, some people are still born into battles they never see coming, and sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one sleeping beside you, recording every moment, waiting for the perfect time to press play. This is the truth Harry carried, the truth he's finally, painfully beginning to speak, and it's worse than any of us imagined.